for a typical B2C business, 40 to 80% of the customers will buy one time and they'll never come back.
Behavioral attributes are discrete. They're right there. They're observable. You have them. They're first party.
We've now productized the model and automated it in a way that never had been possible before.
Insights into the innovations and revolutions of the marketing world. Welcome to the Marketing Scientists Podcast.
Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Marketing Scientists. Today, we're actually talking to a real scientist. This is Daniel McCarthy, an associate professor of marketing at the Robert H. Smith School of Business from the University of Maryland, and also a co-founder of ThetaCLV.com. This was a fantastic conversation about customer lifetime value and how it should be viewed by marketers, both in B2C and B2B. So let's dive in. Daniel, I am super excited to have you here. This is going to be a ton of fun. I've watched a bunch of your other podcast appearances and read a lot about sort of your writing. But the question that I actually want to start from is a little bit more personal. So you have been a founder, you have been a professor, and you've, done a ton of work in sort of getting your message about LTV and other sort of research that you've done out there in the world. How did all of those different things happen? Like, was that intentional where you wanted to be a startup founder, but also be a professor? Like, just talk to me about how all of that came together.
Yeah, it's a good question. I blame Pete Fader for the Entrepreneurial venture. I wish I could say there was this master plan from the beginning, but really, if you had asked me when I was an undergrad, would you go and start your own business? I would have laughed you out of the room because I had historically been very risk averse. And I guess what I found is over the years, I'm actually totally okay with it. It's there's
Nice.
Yeah, it's I don't think there's kind of a right or a wrong for the sort of mentality that you have, but I do find that both as an academic and as an entrepreneur, there's a certain type of mentality that works. And then there's another where, you could probably do it, but it's going to be painful. And, I have found that just kind of embracing the uncertainty and no one's going to tell you the answer. You just kind of need to chart out your own path. That's perfectly okay. So
no, it's a great answer, right? Because I also think about marketing and, specifically what you all do with marketing science as that, which is you're kind of dealing with a certain amount of uncertainty and you're trying to figure out how to make that more and more certain over time. And entrepreneurship is very much like that, is you start with a little bit of uncertainty and you're trying to get more and more confident over time. Okay, so I want to jump straight into this thing that I found, and I saw your writing about this back in the day. I think you got a whole bunch of fame from this. Was your study of Blue Apron and sort of seeing maybe the red flags sort of early before sort of what happened with that business in the public markets. Talk to me about how that came out to be. Like, was that sort of just out of your own initiative, and what did you find? Like, give us the lowdown on how that came to be.
Yeah, it really was. It just was kind of by random chance that I had I successfully defended my dissertation. My dissertation was all about this same topic: customer-based corporate valuation, how you can do it with public firms. And so the S1 dropped, and I took a look, and it had these really enticing data points in there, at the cohort level. And so I said, why the heck not? If there's going to be a time where I can do this, now's the time. And so I just kind of went in there and messed around with their data. And one thing led to another. And I was like, wow, this is what the retention curve looks like. So yes, it was really, truly random. If I defended my dissertation a year prior, I don't know if there would have been that Blue Apron analysis.
Fascinating. Okay. And so You mentioned corporate, customer-based corporate valuation. Tell us what that framework involves for a marketing audience. Like, how should they think about that? Is it as simple as essentially looking at retention curves, or is there something more that that doesn't meet the eye when you use those words?
Yeah, retention. While customers are with you, how much revenue are you getting from them, and then how much are you spending to get the customer in the door in the first place? And then how much variable profit are you keeping from the revenue that you're getting from the customer? And that's really, that's kind of the essence of the analytical exercise of doing the customer work. And then you just kind of put that right on top of a standard traditional financial valuation model that's based on cash flow. And that's all there is to it. So, I'll often say, every dollar of revenue at a customer-based business has to come from a customer making a purchase. And so, here we are in marketing. We got these great models for predicting future customer purchase behavior. And it's kind of like, well, if it's really that good, then it should be able to give you a clean read on what revenue will be in the future if you kind of do all the bookkeeping properly. So, yeah, so kind of, I'd say that the main value add of this framework is that it can give you, for one, a good estimate of what future revenue will be, and then kind of how the customer behavior will get you there, kind of from an FP&A type way of thinking about it. And then the second is understanding like the unit economic health of the phone. What is LTV to CAC? You hear these metrics and ratios, bandied about on social media all the time. But to have a way of calculating that's principled and that the CFO of the organization would actually vigorously agree with, that's really kind of what we would be aiming for.
Got it. So, in your, and I like how you make it sound super simple. Why are more firms not doing it? Or have you seen that change over the course of the last few years, where I'm sure people are reaching out to you all the time about, hey, how can we implement this for our business? Are you seeing more adoption? Are you seeing people still struggle with it? Like, what do you think are the barriers in implementing that type of methodology?
Yeah, there's kind of this Scylla and Charybdis, I think that's the Odyssey, where you've got the one extreme and then the other. And we really see both show up a lot. The one is the future is unknowable. Everything is so dynamic, 6 months from now, it could all be different. And so what good is LTV if I don't know what's going to happen a year from now? And so that's kind of the one extreme. Like, you can't really do any modeling. And then the other extreme is, yeah, we can do that in Excel, on some stupid spreadsheet. And it's been amazing how often we'll see both.
Interesting.
Yeah, I think that the truth is somewhere in the middle, that business is dynamic, but it's kind of an empirical question. How well can we predict future behavior? And so, that's very empirically testable. And, we've had the opportunity to run these predictive models on, 350, 400 distinct businesses across all of their customers and all sorts of business cycles, ups and downs and COVID, major periods of disruption that are sector specific. And we have been very surprised at just how regular the behavior can be. It's not that it's always regular, but it's a lot more regular than the people on that one side of the extreme would have you believe. But then the people on the other side, I think it's more dynamic than they would have you believe. So, yeah, so I think that's kind of the funny middle ground position that we end up situating ourselves in. That the customers you acquire today, they may be different in value than the customers that you acquired 2 years ago. And things are evolving and changing across the cohorts, hopefully not in a completely unpredictable way, but certainly in a way that if you had a really good model, you could get a very good estimate of what all those customers, even the ones that you're going to acquire over the next, couple of months, what they're going to do in the future.
So I have a follow-up question there for my own sort of understanding here. When you have a really good model, and you also talked about sort of using historical data to build those sort of predictions. So give me an example, and let's make it real. Let's use a company like Paramark. So we're tiny, very little sample size to build a predictive model. But let's say we have hundreds of customers, and we have 2 years of history. And we're very much B2B, not B2C, right?
Yeah.
Like it's a different type of a business. When you think about modeling a business like this, where does your mind go in terms of the types of attributes or behaviors that you would want to sort of look at to build that, or at least evaluate the predictive ability of those attributes or behaviors? What would you say? Or am I even asking the wrong question?
No, I think that's absolutely the right question. And certainly B2B versus B2C is an important dimension that kind of changes what you would want to focus on, or kind of what your prior would be about the sort of dynamics that you would see. So, we'll often say that the same underlying model is used in both settings, but the sort of monetization patterns are like so different from each other, you know? And in particular with B2B, you've got that phenomenon of very strong development amongst the customers that stay with you. And typically in B2C settings, it's more the customer is a melting ice cube. And the big question is, how fast is the melt? So all those, revenue curves, they all kind of go down like this somehow. And the question is, well, is it like this or is it like this?
And where is it going to stabilize? Yeah.
Yeah, in B2B, sometimes you get the revenue, it's just like up like this. So the norms would be different. And that can make it kind of tricky if you have 2 years of data. Because, imagine in year 1, you're like this, and then you kind of move up pretty meaningfully in year 2. Well, what do you assume for year 3 through 10? If you just kind of like extrapolated the first couple years, you could end up with, infinite valued customers, and that's probably not going to be true. So it does help when you have a dynamic like that to either kind of cap the horizon, be conservative in terms of when you flat it, look to benchmarks of other, kind of marketing oriented B2B firms that do a similar thing. What sort of patterns have you heard about from them? But any sort of data like that can kind of help you triangulate what those really unmodelable assumptions would have to be. And that's not really having anything to do with dynamics. It's not like, business disruption would be creating that uncertainty. It's really just inherently that you have customers whose value is growing over time. And so inherently, oftentimes in B2B settings, you have a lot more value coming from like years 5 onwards. And so, if you only had 3 years of data, then that puts you in a pretty tough spot versus like a men's underwear D2C brand where most of the value is extracted actually in the very first purchase. But certainly the vast majority is extracted in the first year. And so, that kind of gives you a lot more to work with if you have 2 years worth of data.
On that point, so it's such a fascinating, we serve customers who are both B2B and B2C, which is fascinating. We get to see very different data sets ourselves. And it's so hard to run a B2C business for the reason that you're talking about, right? Because you're always having to work harder towards acquiring net new customers because the lifetime value is relatively lower. So in that environment, what have you seen as kind of the top 1% or 5% of brands do to really maximize that lifetime value? Like, are there things that you have observed or seen that are different between those top brands and the long tail?
Well, certainly having a whole bunch of Fanatics, just the existence of Fanatics who just love you like crazy, that says something about product market fit. And so obviously, not every customer will be a Fanatic, but it does mean something when people can love you that much and do, So that certainly can be a tell. I like customer retention, kind of on its own. And then also kind of the revenue retention analog to it, that just the fact that people are staying around for a while, that's saying, I really like your product. So I think that to me, it obviously all else equal, it means a higher CLV typically, but just in and of itself, it's saying something about the staying power of the product in the consumer's mind, But
do you think that is something? I was going to ask a follow up around that. Do you think there's something inherent about the category of the product itself that
I do?
Yeah.
So I mean, that was
say more.
My follow up, that there are very kind of category specific norms. So if you're a mattress seller, or you're just selling a slower moving good, then you kind of have to shift your reference point for what good even is. And so you wouldn't want to say that every single mattress business has to be terrible. That we know that doesn't sound like a reasonable statement. But what it means is you have to make all the variables fit around that reality that people aren't going to buy for many years until they make their next purchase typically. And so your CAC has to be lower. You have to make more of the profit on the first purchase, but those variables, you can make them fit. But it also means that, when I'm looking at like the report card for a company like that, it's going to look quite different from the report card for, a marketing oriented B2B firm.
Totally makes sense. And what I find interesting is that might also define the potential size of that eventual business, right? Because if you're inherently limited by the frequency of purchase or the time lag between purchases within that category, and you have to hit a certain CAC, there's a natural limit to growth, right? So
Mhm.
do you advise brands to kind of do that work up front before they even sort of go after a product launch, or is it being too scientific to do that?
I think it's important, yeah, and certainly another example of that is like luxury businesses versus businesses that appeal to a much larger market. In theory, they could have the same total applicable market, like everyone could buy, but if you're selling a $3,000 handbag, realistically speaking, the market that you can really sell into is going to be much smaller for that business than, some cheap meal cake business or something like that, So if you know that you have many fewer people who will, for all practical purposes, be able to acquire, then you want to make sure that you're earning a higher rate of return on each of those customers, So one thing that I'll often say is for a B2B business, LTV to CAC, what is a good LTV to CAC? And, for a B2B business that has a much smaller applicable market, there's just less units available to adopt. Then logically speaking, you need a higher rate of return, to be able to eventually kind of work your way into profitability.
Okay, that's a great point. So I have so many questions about this topic, but I actually want to circle back to one thing that we missed. And that was when you look at those, curves from a, customer retention or revenue retention perspective. And you also mentioned this idea of Fanatics. Do you think about the relative value of different units or different customers within a given cohort, right? So here's even for example, on a B2C example, right? You might have an e-commerce shop and you have some customers who are buying really high order value type of products and some people who are buying sort of lower order value type of, products or what have you. How do you segment? And this, because I've seen this in every one of our customers, like, hey, some customers are more valuable than others. Are we bringing in high quality customers? Are we bringing in lower quality customers? Right? Especially when we're talking about marketing. How do you advise thinking about that from a modeling perspective, and how precise are you getting? Or do you think that's like over precise in terms of, tying marketing measurement with that relative value of a given customer? I hope you understand like where that question is coming from.
Yeah, certainly there's the kind of consumer insight piece of it that it could be very helpful to know, just how much spread there is in value within the cohort. So we absolutely will do all of our modeling at the individual level precisely for that reason, because at the end of the day, if you couldn't really target individual consumers, then you actually would probably do better to model at the aggregate level, because there's tremendous sparsity that comes in when you're predicting for Bob, because for a typical B2C business, 40 to 80% of the customers will buy one time and they'll never come back. And you can just imagine when you got that on the one side, and then the other side, you've got this 5% of the base that's just buying like bonanzas. It's really hard on a model, So we'll often kind of look to, I think there is the question of what is actually actionable for the business. And if you don't have the ability to take action on individual consumers, then it could be very good information to know, but you can't really do anything about it. Yeah, if you can kind of take action at the level of acquisition cohort or product of first purchase or the mode of first purchase, was it in a store, was it online, or different geographical regions, that you have something that you can work with, But we tend to advocate focusing on that sort of actionable unit because otherwise you run the risk of kind of learning interesting information that you can't really do a whole lot about.
I love that. So trying to think about how you're going to action the insight before you even go down the path of generating that insight, because if it's not actionable, what's the point? Makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, another follow-up on that is the types of attributes that feed this model. Are you looking at sort of, there are two things that are top of mind for me. One is sort of behaviors that you can just literally observe from somebody's, Bob's sort of interactions with your shop. The other is any demographic data that you might have.
Mm-hmm.
The third is, this one is like the most spiciest one for me, is all the marketing measurement type of attributes. Hey, this person clicked in from a social ad versus from a, Google search ad versus, whatever else.
Mm.
How do you think about, and maybe I missed other sort of attributes, what's the spectrum of things that you would expect to feed into the model?
Yeah, I think we found that behavioral attributes tend to be the most predictive of future value. Um, Now the attributes surrounding where they came from, the source of transactions and the source of acquisition, even if you didn't have a whole lot of spread in terms of customer value, sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. There you can have pretty big differences in cost. And so, for the one, very big differences in forward-looking behavior. For the other, potentially that, but then also pretty big differences in how much you're spending to generate that sort of behavior. So those, to me, tend to be where most of the juice is, where most of the action is. Demographic variables, we just have not found a whole lot of success with those. And I think it could be that, some of them, if you had those observed without any error, like you had the actual data, like the ground truth demographic data, it could be very predictive. But anyone who starts like looking around and like looking carefully at it, I think they'll often find that it's like pretty junky. And so yeah, you're getting something very far from ideal, and I think it just kind of biases the signal coming from that data towards zero.
Okay, that's a really interesting point. So what you're saying is like, hey, if we actually had good data on demographics, maybe it could be useful. We wouldn't know. We would have to run it through to see it. But behavioral sort of attributes are pretty, discrete. They're right there. They're observable. You have them. They're first party. And you find those to be the most predictive of future value. Clarifying question on the where did you come from, sort of question. I find that to be quite as junky as the demographic data because most people are using very simplistic measurement around exactly, right? So if your attribution models are just as junky as your demographic data, then, what's the value and sort of, using them? You have the same bias issue. Am I misunderstanding that or what do you think?
I agree. Yeah, we often say our secret sauce, our specialty is all about the stuff that happens after they make that very first purchase. The stuff that happens before the first purchase, like I believe it, but there are major data issues. And I'm a statistician by training, like that's how I make my living, but yeesh, if you don't have good data, then you can't really do anything. And so all those really good ideas, you're kind of stuck. And I think that to a large extent, a lot of these attribution models, they kind of suffer from that you just have so many omitted but very important variables that you could specify some really rich model, but the data is too dumb. It's just not smart enough to be able to keep up with the model.
Totally fair. Okay, good. I just wanted to make sure my mental model was right about how to think about those attributes because we get these questions all the time from customers. And on that note, so, you've been referencing sort of when we do things. Are you actively working on a product or something right now? Like, tell me more. Like, I might have missed that note.
Yeah, so Theta is the company that I currently run, and Zodiac was the company that I ran before selling to Nike and then starting Theta. So those companies, they do nothing but customer lifetime value type analyses.
There we go. So if somebody wants to engage with Theta, what does that look like? How do they, what is tell us about sort of how you engage with customers.
Yeah, it's a great question. There's kind of two key segments that we work with. One are investors, and that's kind of where we had gotten started. We were contractually forbidden from doing any marketing and analytics type of work after Nike had bought Zodiac, my previous company, for 3 years. And so we were kind of forced to do something else. And customer-based corporate valuation, obviously, that was very near and dear to my heart. It was the topic of my PhD dissertation. But then after 3 years, we could move back into all of the marketing tactical stuff too. So that's really segment number 2 is corporations typically. But there's a whole bunch of other segments that also kind of do CLV type work. So it could be consulting firms. On the one side, that'd be more like the corporate. They're the sell-side investment banks. If there are a number of engagements with them, that'd be more like the investor, but representing a different party. Corp dev divisions within corporations, those should be more like investors, but within the corporate sector. And we're pretty flexible. I'd say that historically, our model has been, because we've kind of really refined our value proposition around private equity. Private equity firms will come to us and say, "You got this deal. It's super hot. We got 2 weeks for you to run the numbers. We need to know." And we say, "Sure." Right. We've kind of refined everything to be able to sprint like that and get the work done. So we can be quite flexible. Usually, whether you're an investor or you're a company, you've got these specific burning questions in your mind as to what you want to evaluate. And so, we'll kind of apply the CLV lens to help answer those questions. I'd say the big thing for 2025 is we've now kind of productized the model and automated it in a way that never had been possible before. And so there's a couple of very kind of like high distribution use cases that we can now pursue that had never been possible before. And so, just having like a Docker container or some sort of licensed version of what we do where they can run it on 200 companies. And, I think that's now possible. So, we're really excited.
Very cool. That. So if a customer of Paramark, high growth startup has 5-7 years of history, data, wanted to run through Theta, could they? Or is that not part of your
yep.
sort of
100%
spot? Yep.
Yeah, 100%.
All right. So there you go.
Is anyone out there?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's the plug. Is it theta.com? How do people get in touch with you?
ThetaCLV.com. Yeah, we are true to
ThetaCLV.com.
Yeah, so
love it. Okay, cool. So I want to circle back to this. You had talked about sort of the Blue Apron study that you had done as part of your sort of PhD, if I'm not wrong. But since then, is there another example that comes to your mind where when you did, either a CBCV or an LTV type of study with a brand, where the leadership team's perspective on their business just completely changed, in a positive way, hopefully? Is there an example that comes to mind that you're able to share with the audience?
Yeah, there's one that we can't name the name, and actually, this analysis was on behalf of a prospective investor in the company. But it was a beauty brand, and they had a business model where they would provide samples, and then they have some customers they just bought list price from the very beginning, and then you have other customers that they start with a sample, and then they hopefully graduate into being a regular list price buyer. And the big question for them was, how valuable are those sample buyers? And it was especially important because customer acquisition was rocketing upwards. And so they had most of their customers acquired very recently. So they really needed to know that. And it was important because then, should they get more aggressive with the samples, or should they get less aggressive? And what we ended up finding was that these customers that kind of were adopted through the samples, they were valuable. They weren't as valuable as the customers that were list priced from the very start, but they were still making money hand over fist with these customers. So, yes, we ended up concluding that if anything, this company should really get much more aggressive with the samples. Not only did they look good, but we were saying if you looked at the implied rate of return on their investments in terms of the discount that they were applying on the samples, the rate of return was almost too high. So that was it was a very heartening analysis, very uplifting, and I think I thought very highly of that business after having done that analysis.
That is so interesting. How did you all make the connection between, is getting super tactical, between the users or the customers who first took the samples and then eventually became, customers? Like, what was the connection point between those two data points?
Oh, the samples were paid. And so that was another important point, that if the samples were free, the trackability, I could imagine, would be harder. But they were paying, weren't paying full price. And so, yeah, so we had full observability, and they kind of very carefully, but you could kind of infer it through the transaction data that the spend amounts were, at the discount level as opposed to the full price level. Yeah, that's kind of what allowed be able to have that sort of observability to be able to factor that into the analysis in the first place.
Gotcha. That's fascinating. And if you don't mind sharing, so what was the hypothesis there? Was it more about an interesting entry point? Was it more about just the fact that it was a trial? Did you all do any follow-up research around what was the psychology that was causing that type of, high LTV from a sample?
Yeah, it's a good question. We didn't have a whole lot of other data. We certainly spent a lot of time thinking about, call it like the sample to list price conversion curve. And
right.
Yeah, as you can imagine, there's a lot of people, they just do the samples or they do the sample the one time, but they never make any other purchase. But then there's other people who, kind of fall into the sweet spot, what the company is hoping for. And so that was holding up. Those curves were holding up really quite well. But yeah, that was kind of like a follow-up analysis that we had done. But yeah, I think that the reason that's really important to do that sort of analysis is time and again, you're going to always find the customers that are acquired through a discount are typically going to be worse than the customers that come in at list price. That there's this often unobservable selection that happens, that the sort of person who will come in through a discount, they're going to be more price sensitive. They're going to be looking around at other options a little bit more. And so oftentimes it's just harder to hold on to that sort of a customer than it is to someone who just came in at full price. We find the same to be true for customers that make their very first purchase to a store versus online, that the person who comes into the store, they tend to be stickier than the online buyer. But yeah, I think here, while those kind of general priors would hold true, the big question is, well, how much worse are the sample customers? And if they're too much worse, then it might be a bad idea. But if they're actually still really quite good, then that could be a very legitimate customer acquisition vehicle.
Got it. Okay, fascinating. Couple of questions before I take you to my rapid fire round. So I feel like the last 3 years have changed a lot of what's happening in sort of the economy, right? So I feel like capital has gotten a lot more harder to get. Uncertainty has gone up. I don't know if I'm misrepresenting what's going on. You're in the economics and statistics world, so tell me if I'm wrong. And generally, sort of consumer sentiment also tends to be a little bit sort of negatively trending. Do you imagine all of these things changing how you think about LTV, or how should brands really sort of think or factor all of those things into what happens in the next 3 or 4 years?
That's the other reason you need the right model. So our very first CBCV paper, we did the analysis on Dish Network and SiriusXM. Those were the two kind of empirical case studies that we applied the methodology to. And it just so happened that our data spanned, before, during, and after the Great Recession of 2008. And you just can see clear as day, acquisitions took a big tumble and churn went way up, but then came back to normal. It came back to kind of a level that you would have expected, given like the pre-GFC type data. And so really, the moral of that story is you want the ability to kind of control for those events. And whether it's, the great financial crisis, whether it's COVID, whether it's seasonality, there's just all sorts of reasons why oftentimes demand is quite variable over time. And if you acquire a customer right before a seasonally elevated period and then run your CLV model right after it, that cohort's going to look amazing. But really what you should know is that they were born right before a seasonally elevated period. So if you kind of, control for that event, then, they look much more normal. So you really want to make sure that you have a model that can kind of detect those sorts of events, whether they're non-recurring, like hopefully COVID is, or recurring, like the Christmas season is, or recurring as a function of customer tenure. That oftentimes we'll see this annual effect. That at your 1 year anniversary, at your 2 year anniversary after being born,
right,
you tend to come back. And so, yeah, especially you see that in like flower type businesses, but certainly in many others, see it there too. Uh, so yeah, so you want to make sure that you're kind of factoring all that in so that you're not getting faked out by those factors. Um, I think the other aspect, as we think about today is, just kind of by way of implication, if we were to have another financial crisis or another deep recession or something like that, it would certainly negatively affect repeat rates. It certainly would have probably a more pronounced effect on customer acquisition. So, and if we don't have a good projection of what that might look like, then we are going to be over optimistic. So one other thing that we'll often recommend is take that base case from your CLV model as a starting point. But if you really wanted to be careful and cautious, sensitize your model. And you can absolutely run those sorts of scenarios, especially if you have data at least for like comparable companies that had been through other events that might serve as reference points for, the sort of dip that you might see as a result of, tariffs or something like that.
Got it. That's a super helpful response, Daniel. Thank you. Okay, rapid fire. I'm going to ask you a bunch of questions to close this out. The first one, what is the most overrated metric and the underrated metric in your domain that you observe?
The most overrated metric and the most underrated metric. Well, I'd say the one that's most overrated relative to its popularity. Oh man, I almost hate to say it. Well, how about like 3-month revenue? Or I hate to almost say this, but like revenue payback. What a trashy metric.
Interesting.
Yeah. Revenue payback.
Interesting. Okay, wait. I gotta dig in. So tell me why. Tell me, like, payback is all the rage these days in pretty much every domain, every marketing team that I talk to. So what's your point of view on that?
It's important. Yeah, certainly you want to have velocity on your money. But one, if you're gonna look at payback period, look at the real payback period. And you're not going to get the real payback period if you're comparing revenue to acquisition cost. What you want to compare acquisition cost, you want to compare it to variable profit. At least do gross profit. But even that's not quite right. But oftentimes there's all the payment processing and the fulfillment, and sometimes it's not part of COGS. And so, so you really want to make sure you've got a nice, like fully loaded variable profit figure that you're feeding into, into what's kind of chipping away at the acquisition cost, So.
You're making all the VCs very queasy right now, but I totally appreciate what you're saying. That's absolutely the right way. This was supposed to be rapid fire, but I had to ask you the detailed question. That's great. What is the most underrated?
Oh, this is so not rapid fire. Well, I'm just going to fall back on, how about like an 8-year profit CLV? Long enough to be...
Okay. I can see the two ends of the spectrum now. Yes.
Too far out.
Makes sense. Okay. What is a brand that you admire a lot from a data perspective, or their sophistication with data perspective?
A company that I admire a lot from a data sophistication perspective, I'd have to probably go with Netflix. Yeah, they're and spoken with people and their internal team. They got great models and they have a lot of actionability.
Got it. All right. Great response. Last one. What is one story about, and again, this is, not rapid fire, so I apologize, but what is one story about Zodiac or Theta that you've never shared publicly, that you're willing to share publicly?
The original Blue Apron analysis, it was, I got to give a ton of credit to Val Rasterguev. And when we think about the origin story for Theta, there were kind of two connection points. Obviously, one is with Pete, but the other big one is with Val. He's basically kind of heading the day-to-day operations of the business. But yeah, he and I actually tag teamed to get that initial Blue Apron analysis done together. So I gave him full credit on the LinkedIn post. His name, if you go to the original analysis, it was there. Nice. But it was really interactions like that one. And he got his MBA at Wharton. So we thought the world of this guy. And we're just kind of plotting out, how do we just get this thing going? We just sold Zodiac to Nike. We wanted to kind of continue moving ahead. So we got to reach out to Val. So, so I don't think that anyone was aware of just how deeply we had been kind of connected with him and how instrumental he's been in, kind of bringing us to where we are.
That's awesome. And a perfect note to end it on. So for everybody who's listening, if you need help with your CLV modeling, or you're just curious about sort of how to think about this whole problem set, ThetaCLV.com. Go follow Daniel on LinkedIn. He's actually quite prolific there. I feel like you talk about stuff online. Is there anything else? Any other sort of places where you hang out online where people can find you?
These days, LinkedIn is where it's at. That's kind of my main platform. Used to have a Twitter presence, but that is no longer. So, but sorry, I won't even go there. I'm not even going to go there. But yeah, and it's funny.
I know.
Netflix. I was just singing their praises. So hopefully everyone's there. No, I'm not. I love them as a firm, but yeah, my most recent thing on LinkedIn was just, I won't say tearing them to shreds, but I was certainly very displeased that they're now not disclosing their subscriber count publicly anymore. So, but that's the sort of stuff.
I saw your post about it. Yeah, I saw your post about that. And actually, I did say I was closing it out, but I actually have a follow-up here. So you're also a professor. You teach in college, and you're doing Theta. Like, that's a lot of stuff going on. How do you balance the two? Like, what's your philosophy around balancing these two very different disciplines?
Yeah, I think for one, knowing when to get out of the way becomes incredibly important. So I know what I'm good at, and I know that, like, this thing and this thing. And for everything else, I'm either not good at it, or one could even say that I'm incompetent at it. So I think the reality-based view of your strengths and your weaknesses, and then knowing who to bring onto the team who can help fill out, the weaknesses and be just complementary to you. I think that's, it's important for the health of the business, and it's important for your own sanity. I think keeping the startup's focus aligned with what you think about as an academic, that's also real, because it's really hard if you're going like these completely different directions. Just the context switching can become kind of crippling, honestly. So yeah, I think that's kind of number two. And then number three is, there's nothing that gets around the grind. I'm not a hustle porn kind of a guy, but I would say you have to work really hard. So there's no getting around that part. But those first two, hopefully between all three of them, that can kind of get you over.
I love it. No, that was a great response, Daniel. Thank you so much for coming on this show. And yeah, everyone's going to get a ton of value out of this. They're going to go check out that ThetaCLV.com. I will too. And we'll do this again and talk about some more stuff, maybe in a few months.
Yeah, I would love to. So yeah, it's been great. And certainly you talk about things you haven't done before. Yeah, I think a lot of the stuff that we talked about are things that I haven't talked before, which I think, again, that's a testament to you as a host.
Love it. Awesome. All right, folks, that was Daniel McCarthy. As you heard during the episode, check out ThetaCLV.com to find out how the best brands in the business are calculating their customer lifetime value and how you can do the same. Or go follow Daniel on LinkedIn. He's amazing. All right. Tune in again next week for another great episode.